The 2019 Teacher's Guide to Technology is here from my friend, Jennifer Gonzalez. Go to coolcatteacher.com/guide and stay tuned for more. Beware of time-wasting, low-level technology learning. Episode 431.
The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today.
So today we're talking with my friend Thomas C. Murray, or we call him Tom, who has done so many things with helping technology as he works with Future Ready Schools with the Alliance for Excellent Education. Tom, I know you have a story about your first experience with one-to-one 17 years ago. Tell us that story.
It was 17 years ago. I was a relatively new teacher. It was 2002, and my classroom was one-to-one. And one-to-one Palm Pilots. You remember those things?
I do. I had one.
And at one hand, we can laugh about it now. On the other hand, I was quoted in the local newspaper as saying, I'd love to see these units become standard equipment for all students in 5 to 10 years. So I'm not going to tell you about the credibility of your guest here, I guess, today. But Vicki, it really was the beginning to mobility. It was something, these were devices that my kids took home in 4th grade 17 years ago. So they had a device on them throughout the day. And one of the things that this really hit home for me then was, the use of technology. I was a brand new teacher. I was willing to try new things. But let me premise it with this. I had a principal that created a culture of innovation. He created a culture of risk-taking. It was a culture where folks would be willing to try something new. However, and I would say, he also really pushed us to make sure it wasn't just about the fluff. One of the things that I see all the time on social media, Vicki, is we seem to be celebrating low-level learning. I want to be really clear here, and I'll share how I really learned this through my own failure. Just because something is digital does not mean it's any good. And we see things celebrating all the time. And I'll push us on this here as well, even around this notion of engagement. So let me tell the story real quick. So I think I was a second-year teacher. We had these Palm Pilots one-to-one, and we were all fired up about them. And my principal was coming the following week. So I knew he was doing some sort of observation. So being a new teacher, like any teacher would, I wanted to impress him. So my mindset was, if he comes in and he sees me using the technology and the kids using the technology the entire time, he'll be impressed. And so, of course, I know that he's coming. So what do? I put together the dog and pony show. I put together, this is going to impress him. And so the following week, now don't judge, it was a 30-minute spelling lesson. Don't judge. 17 years later, I struggle to say that publicly, but it was what it was. And so here's what we did. For 30 minutes, students essentially, and I prefaced it with some questions, and we reviewed the software. It was called Graffiti that we'd be using on the Palm Pilots. And for probably 20 of the 30 minutes, what students were doing, they had their own individualized spelling lists. And hey, 17 years later, I'm pretty proud of that. But they essentially would use the Graffiti, which was like a handwriting type program on the Palm Pilot, and they would beam it over to their partner. Their partner would then check their individualized spelling list, give them feedback, and they beamed it back and forth. And so for 30 minutes, I can tell you, every question that I asked, it seemed like my kids all responded to. Every time I had a question, every hand went up. And being observed, I'm thinking I should pay these kids later because they're making me look good, right? For 30 straight minutes, I had 100% engagement. Every kid did exactly what I asked them to do. For 30 straight minutes, they followed my directions. For 30 straight minutes, my lesson plan was followed to a T. And I can laugh about it now. I remember kind of thinking at the end of that lesson, like, my principal just watched me absolutely crush this lesson, and I can't wait till tomorrow until he tells me how great it was, and I can laughingly say that now. So the next day I get to school and I'm all fired up to go to my post observation, feeling like, hey, my lesson plan was followed perfectly. Technology was used the whole time. They did exactly what I wanted them to do. So I walked down to the office. Principal's name is Bill, an incredible instructional leader. And again, creating that culture of risk taking. So I sat down across from my principal, and Bill looks at me and smiles. And like every principal's asked many times, he looked across and said, "So Tom, how do you think the lesson went?"
Oh,
and
yeah, that's such a hard question.
Heard that, right? And it's almost, and having been a principal for a long time, you almost feel like it's almost a setup question, and not that it's intentional, but it came across from that. And I smiled and I said, Bill, I feel it went really well. Every kid was engaged. I used technology the whole time. They did exactly what I asked. And he smiled and he said, so Tom, let me ask you this. So what were your learning objectives? And I said, well, we wanted to use the Palm Pilots to be able to. And he said, no, stop. What were your learning objectives? And I was like, maybe he didn't hear me. We wanted to use the Palm Pilots to be able to. And he said, no, Tom, stop. He said, I need to push you on this. Every time I ask you about learning, you start talking about technology. Vicki, I could show you where I was sitting when he started to push me on that. He was spot on. I had created this lesson because it could do something. And he went on and he said, Tom, he said, the things that you're sharing, was the management stuff in place? Absolutely. Was your lesson plan followed? Absolutely it was. But Tom, I want to push you on this. In 30 minutes, what did kids really learn? And I remember it hitting me like a ton of bricks. And he didn't say it in a condescending way. He knew that I was at a point where he could really push me instructionally. And he said this, Tom, I really believe that you created that lesson because the technology could do something, not because it was the best way to learn something.
Wow.
Almost 20 years later, Vicki, I could show you where I was sitting. This instructional leadership conversation fundamentally changed the way I looked at technology. He then went on to push me with this, Vicki, and he said, Tom, let me ask you, could they have done the exact same thing with the exact same outcome, pencil and paper, and in 6 or 7 minutes instead of using the technology for 30? Mm. And he was spot on. Wow. I created the lesson because the tech could do something. I had 100% engagement. And I remember him saying, did you have 100% engagement? He said, yeah, I really think you did. But Tom, I want to push you. It's 100% on low level stuff. And it's really changed my mindset on it because he was spot on. He called me out in a loving way. Listen, he was an incredible principal, but it was the purpose of a real supervision meeting. Because you know what I think we often do is we celebrate low-level learning. Let me give you an example. Many times today, I'll work with principals or I'll coach principals and we'll talk about supervision. And here's an example that I'll see all over the country. They have this little walkthrough form, this 5-minute walkthrough form, and they walk into a classroom. And one of the things on their 5-minute walkthrough form is students are using technology. And what do? We check it off the list. Yep, they're using it. Vicki, that's no different than walking into a classroom and being like, yep, the lights are on, check. Because at the end of the day, I want to push on it. So what? And I'm somebody that loves ed tech. So this isn't a condescending way of ed tech. I'm somebody that loves it, but when it's used well. Because we can be 100% digital, leveraging technology 100% of the time. And just like I was for that lesson, 100% low-level learning. Now, I also want to be clear, like there's a starting place for every one of us. And, just getting ourselves to that point is a starting place. So I'm not knocking it. My principal recognized in me that I was ready for the conversation of I need to make sure that I'm hyper-focused on instruction and not just focused on celebrating something's digital. And I think years later, decades later here, I think we're still doing a lot of that. We're celebrating. We're totally paperless. At the end of the day, respectfully, so what?
Yeah.
Because we can be, and so how do we make sure that we stay hyper-focused on the learning side? And I will tell you, here we are all those years later, it fundamentally changed the view of the way I see technology. I'm glad I had a principal that really pushed me on that, again, in a loving way, but then also creating that culture. I left there having learned with my head high. I didn't leave that principal's office that day with my heart ripped out. He recognized great things that did happen, but at the same time, he really pushed me on the instructional piece, and I think we can never lose sight of that.
Yeah. And, sometimes people just look at technology classrooms so superficially. I know that, for example, the news media was at my school on the first day. And I always use Play-Doh on my first day because I want to get to know the kids and I have them, I call it Masterpiece Theater, and they have to model something that's a masterpiece. And then, of course, they take the photo and they upload it to the LMS and they learn all how to use the technology. But we start with Play-Doh. Well, this person was coming to my room to see the 3D printer and the VR and all the cool stuff we had going on. And I had to tell my principal to delay I can't believe I'm admitting this, to delay the media so that I could have the Play-Doh.
Right.
But I was using it for a purpose. I mean, there was a reason, there was a purpose. And why do we do that? Is it because we're so superficial and we just check the box, or people don't want to know what the technology is really doing? Or have we lost sight of it's about what we're teaching?
Yeah, I think it comes from multiple directions. I think, having been in a district where I help lead a one-to-one, I think teachers get pressure being, hey, we just went one-to-one. Our board invested all this money. You need to be using it. And so on one hand, I get that mindset. I get if we're investing in it, we don't want it sitting in closets. I get that. But I also think we're celebrating, and I'm talking to administrators here, sometimes what's really ultimately low level. And so from an admin end, how do we model this kind of work? How do we model efficient and effective use? You're referencing 3D printers. About a year and a half ago, I wrote a blog post and the title was, "No, your 3D printer does not make you innovative, period." And I got some hate mail for it, and I don't really care. I did it in a loving way. But point being, sometimes we're using it we're downloading the code as the teacher. We are then printing something out. We're putting it on social media, like, look at us, we're 3D printing, or we're just having kids just watch the 3D printer. And at the end of the day, if that's how we use it, like, we're again celebrating low level stuff. You might as well.
Are they 3D designing? Are they 3D designing or are they 3D printing?
Correct. And the design and the iteration process is where the learning happens. And that 3D print is that final product or assessment. But yet sometimes we jumped right to that. And maybe it's the same with even something like robots. If we're just driving it around, celebrating that we're using robots, we're not learning anything. I drove a remote control car 30 years ago, right? But it's the design, the coding, the iteration process where that learning occurs. And so whether you're talking the robots in the classroom, the 3D printers in the classroom, or 17 years ago for me, the Palm Pilots in the classroom, how it's used is what matters most, not that it's being used. And quite often we're celebrating that it's being used. We've got to really focus on that depth of knowledge piece and those level piece. Again, I recognize for certain people just using it as a starting point, not trying to be condescending at all to that, but we have to recognize what it is. If we're celebrating low level learning, that's a problem.
Wow. So I guess our thought-provoking question for today is, are we celebrating low-level learning, or are we really getting into a deeper knowledge? Thanks, Tom.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks, Vicki.
Jennifer Gonzalez has released her 2019 Teacher's Guide to Technology with over 200 education technology tools, including tools for assessment, flipped learning, presentations, parent engagement, video engagement, and more. In this guide, you get a simple description, a screenshot of the tool, and a play button that takes you to a video about how the tool works. Learn more at coolcatteacher.com/guide. Now, I am an affiliate for this product, which means I am paid a small percentage of the fee if you purchase it. This is at no additional cost to you, and I only recommend the best products for educators on the 10-Minute Teacher. So, the 2019 Teacher's Guide to Technology. Hope you enjoy.
Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.